Welcome to Bidgely Engage Plus, a monthly video series focused on the energy industry and the people driving innovation forward. We're here in Seattle, Washington to talk with officials from Seattle City Light who are driving innovation around transportation. We will also speak with people from EPRI who have come up with the latest study on advances in electrification. Let's get started. Seattle has a strong legacy for environmental stewardship, and that has empowered Seattle City Light to be very bold in its thinking. Energy Innovation and Resources Officer Emeka Anyanwu told us how that freedom inspires his team to be forward-thinking.
Historically, Seattle has been a community that has aspired, anyway, to be very forward-thinking and progressive. This is one of the communities and one of the parts of the country that really leaned very heavily into conservation and energy efficiency really early on in the 70s, right? And so there's a long legacy here of environmental stewardship. And so the policy environment here that is welcoming of really forward-thinking, aspirational thinking around both the environment, environmental justice, and ultimately sort of racial and social justice gives this community a unique combination of attributes that allow us to be really bold with our thinking. We can do and say things and aspire to things and attempt things in Seattle that would be much more difficult in other parts of the country. That's certainly inspiring for us, for our team, right? Because it gives us a sort of a sense of purpose. It dares us to think boldly, and a lot of ambition toward both serving our communities, improving the equity of our communities, striving for racial and social justice, and of course, meeting the climate crisis.
Emeka said prioritizing EV transit over personal vehicles was just the bold choice Seattle City Light was encouraged to make.
I think what you see in lots of places, and it certainly is true here, is that personal electric vehicles, right, cars, are the form of electric mobility that really gets the most attention, right? Draws the most attention, gets the most press, gets the most discussion. There's a lot of discussion around vehicle charging and charging access. And those things are certainly all great and important to the electric transportation transition. But, we really looked early on and were in a position to choose to prioritize communities that have historically been underserved, been underrepresented in these conversations, right? And to make their priorities not just first, but primary to what we were trying to do. And so the choice to prioritize public transit above even EV charging, above bikes and walking and other forms of mobility, which are all really important, right, was a bold choice, right? Because again, those are communities, and those are, the communities that rely on those services are communities that often don't get their needs met first, that don't have the first seat at the table in this conversation. And so that was a strategic choice we were able to make that maybe would have met with more resistance maybe in other scenarios. But here in Seattle, we got a lot of support right off the bat from our policymakers, from our communities, for making that choice. We early on sort of identified that relationship, that partnership with King County Metro as one of those key aspects of electrifying public transit. And so many of those communities rely on buses specifically, right? Both transit in general, but certainly buses specifically.
We were there when Seattle City Light, King County Metro, and the city of Tukwila opened their new charging facility.
Thank you all for joining us here today to mark this incredible milestone in the electrification and decarbonization of our region. Transportation electrification really is an integral part of our utilities modernization journey. Electric vehicles, EV cars, may be the most visible of personal mobility forms, but at Seattle City Light, we have identified and decided to prioritize the electrification of transit as a way to better serve our customers and the community and the region at large. When we created our Transportation Electrification Strategic Investment Plan about 2 years ago, in our conversations in the community, the top priority identified by community leaders and other community stakeholders was electrifying public transportation. And in this, as you've heard from some of the other speakers, in this transition, we really have a duty to re-envision an energy system that elevates and uplifts communities throughout the greater Seattle region, but especially those communities that have been historically left out of important conversations and decisions around our energy system. So we're making great strides in the electrification future of our region. these coaches that you see here today are just the first of many that we hope to see on the road.
Emeka went on to put transit electrification in context of Seattle City Light's larger goal to reshape and reimagine the future of electricity.
One of the things that we are certainly really intent on doing across our entire body of work related to electrification is really trying to create a different energy future than the one that preceded it. I'm excited that you're going to talk to members of our team today, obviously, who are going to talk about our electrification assessment that we did with our partners over at EPRI, because again, we're beginning to really think about what does that reality look like for us? What does a world look like for us where we begin to truly move end users away from fossil-based forms of energy?
He recognizes that the grid required to serve a fully electrified utility will look much different than it does today.
What does the grid architecture look like that has to serve this electrified future? What we know really is that the architecture of the system that it will take to serve a fully electrified future is going to look very different than what we have today, and will require different operating protocols, different business models, different control algorithms and capabilities, different situational awareness.
What does it take to achieve such bold goals? Emeka emphasized that utilities need to prioritize both adopting a more data-driven planning process while also meaningfully engaging with communities.
And certainly it is true that we have to not only double down on a lot of our traditional planning disciplines, right, in terms of how we think and plan system and resources, but really we have to expand and evolve those things so that they are much more dynamic and they are much more certainly data rich, right? And so, we have to become much more data intensive and really create an ability for us to think dynamically, to plan dynamically, to operate dynamically with the system. But again, we cannot afford to lose sight of the different ways in which we have to engage communities in doing this work, right? We cannot afford to have an exclusionary process or decision-making paradigm for this, right? We have to engage deeply with communities and directly with communities constantly on an ongoing basis. We have to have conversations about what are the implications of these new frameworks for them, right? The new system capabilities, the new ways in which we are going to think about resiliency and reliability and system flexibility, the ways in which grid and system assets are going to be held and operated. That's one thing where there's really a tremendous opportunity for growth for our entire industry, right? Is, how do we truly engage communities as equal partners in the work of building the next generation energy system?
Next, we had the chance to dive a little deeper into Seattle City Light's public transportation and fleet electrification plans with David Logsdon, Director of Electrification and Strategic Technology. David, tell us about what was the catalyst behind your electrification efforts?
What I find very unique about our approach is we're a very values-based city, we're a very values-based organization. The community connection piece comes from one of our core values as a utility, which is equitable community connections. It's very tempting as a utility to approach something like transportation electrification and just kind of hire a consultant and come up with a game plan. And then maybe your community outreach is like you host some town halls and you say, this is what we're doing, and aren't you excited to benefit from it? And we wanted to turn that around and actually reach out from the earliest stages so that community had a chance to actually give meaningful input to our plan. So that was really critical, was to go to community from the very beginning before you have the plan fully baked so that you're actually able to listen and implement what you're hearing from community.
Can you talk briefly about some of the comments that came from local community folks? What stood out, maybe top two or three items that they were really interested in for their neighborhood?
Yeah. We talked to some of the usual suspects and like the OEMs, the manufacturers, the electric supply companies to get the full picture, but the majority of our outreach was focused on what we call our environmental justice communities and the stakeholders there. And what we were hearing from them was their priorities were not around where should a lot of utility investments and a lot of infrastructure investments take place on personally owned vehicles. Their priorities were public transit, expanding access, and greening the fleets that operate through those environmental justice communities. And that's where efforts like our partnership with King County Metro and battery electric buses come in. And we're also partnering with other transit operators like the Washington State Ferries. They're working to switch to battery electric ferries for the ferry system. That can pose huge loads on the grid, so we're partnering with them early on to understand how we're going to charge those and to develop innovative plans like using battery storage. So transit's number one. And then number two is really the fleets that operate through those communities. So we're launching a big new fleet program later this year that's also informed by ongoing community outreach to structure how those programs get set up, where our focus is, which communities see the most benefit. And then for personally owned vehicles, it's expanding, as I mentioned, the ride-hail vehicles, those are vehicles that operate quite a bit, but then also multi-unit dwelling charging. So how do we best expand for multi-unit dwelling, multifamily buildings? That's a huge focus for us because the majority of our customers live in those buildings. We have a minority of our customers who actually have access to a single-family garage. So we really need to expand the charging infrastructure for those communities. And then access is another piece. The electric vehicles are expensive, so how do we bring that and make that accessible and not have communities, those environmental justice communities, see new charging infrastructure as displacing or gentrifying and actually a community asset. So that's been a big topic too, is like how do we expand access and really bring communities to a point where they actually want charging infrastructure in their community and view it as something that's positive.
You mentioned fleets. I was thinking about companies like Amazon or FedEx or the trucks that we see driving around. Is that a factor?
That's part of the fleet program we're designing. And we've been reaching out to all those fleet operators. Amazon, they've got the partnership with Rivian. And some of it's, initially just understanding where will they be charging so we can plan for that on the grid, because these are big loads and we need to plan for that starting now. And one of the other big fleet operators that we've got our eye on is the trucking out of the ports. There's 3,000 trucks that operate out of the Port of Seattle. So we're trying to figure out how do we best start to do some pilots to understand where we can be effective. And we hear things like, you need to add amenities, like people need to be able to set up and operate their laptop. They want to charge overnight. They already have difficulty finding parking. So we're looking at how do we build some hubs that actually bring amenities to that the operators are looking for. How do we build partnerships? A lot of those operators are smaller shops that maybe have 10 or so trucks and they own their trucks themselves. They work closely with their drivers. So we're trying to build up some of those partnerships and understanding to really figure out how do we start to build comfort with that. And one of the most important things with electrification is that the early experiences be positive.
Speaking of trucks, are people excited about the Ford Lightning and that two-way flow, or is that just more aspirational?
I think that's an important aspect of what we hope to see more of, actually the excitement that people get from that sort of new offering. Because that vehicle-to-building, vehicle-to-grid technology has been out there for a while. Not a lot of people understand the appeal of it, but the Lightning has done a great job of bringing a new market to that, bringing people into the resiliency aspects of it. That's something we're interested in for other purposes, including the work that we did with the Electric Power Research Institute. All of this electrification brings challenges to the grid, and one of the most important pieces of that is how do we influence how that load shows up on the grid? Avoid peaks. We designed the system to peak coincidence. So if we have a system that peaks for a small percentage of the year, and then it's down here the rest of the year, we're building the system for this, and that's poor utilization. It's going to impact our rates. So we're looking at things like the Lightning, for instance, or battery storage behind the meter, demand response. How do we smooth out that load overall as those loads show up?
Bringing it down to the end customer. If some of this takes place and there's a lot of investment, will their rates stay about the same? Will they go up? What do you anticipate from that end customer?
That's where our load forecast comes in. So what's happening with City Light's load over time? Been in a period of very steady load growth without electrification, and we've got load forecasts with and without electrification. Without electrification, we're entering a period, especially coming out of COVID, where commercial load is down, of declining loads. But what that means, it's same asset base. We still have the same number of wires in the system, same substations, but we have fewer sales to spread that across. So rates go up in that scenario for all customers. Electrification, we've got some headroom to build out. We have system capacity. So we need to start doing that to bring the rates within reason. So that helps us to keep affordable rates. Electrification is actually critical to our rate path and keeping rates affordable for all customers. But then over time, and you saw this in the electrification assessment, over time, you shift past that headroom. So then you end up at a point where you need to manage that load growth and you need to build out the system to do that. So that's where strategies like grid modernization come in to prepare the grid now for that load growth that's coming, but also to shift peaks, like looking at demand response, looking at managed charging strategies, looking at vehicle to grid operations. Those are all ways to bring electrification in as a continued resource, even as you enter that later growth phase. We do have a future ahead of us where we're going to need more renewable resources at the bulk level, and that's something we've been preparing for. We've got a large solar array under contract in Washington State. We probably need more of that down the road in the 2026 plus timeframe, so we're starting to look at that. But
battery storage as well.
There's a role for batteries behind the meter. There's also potentially a role for them at that bulk level, but we're at a point where we really need to plan that out and figure out what are the least cost options to do the peak shifting we need to do. So we're testing out things like time of use rates for residential and commercial customers with electric vehicles to incentivize them to charge off peak. We're starting to look at managed charging strategies to incentivize off peak charging, demand response. And battery storage has a role in that, but it's kind of not clear to what level and what scale, because you want to have your least cost option from all of those different resources in that resource basket.
Kind of a classic question of all this, technology that's out there and challenges. Is there one thing that kind of keeps you up at night, or when you look at the long term?
Part of what we're trying to do right now is to prepare for that future of like true electrification at scale. Because personally owned vehicles, they put some strain on the grid, but it's very dispersed. It's somewhat manageable. Those larger loads, like when you get fleets electrifying, when you get heavy-duty trucking electrifying on the I-5 corridor, a heavy-duty trucking depot could be 35 megawatts of peak load you've got to deliver. And then you start to conventionally look at, that's a new substation. Our approach has been get as much early information as you can. Conventional utility model is you sit back, you wait for the service connections request to come to you. You say, yeah, we can serve that. It'll cost you X number of dollars. But we really are at a point where there's a lot of load growth planning, so we really need to know where it's going to be. And the way we're doing that is building these early partnerships. King County Metro, they're electrifying all of their buses by 2035. We're going depot by depot and base by base and actually developing plans with them for each of those bases and like going way beyond the meter in terms of how we relate to customers and basically joining their planning process. Waterfront is similar. We've got 140 megawatts of load growth on the waterfront. Port of Seattle, all the buildings in the waterfront, the ferries, and maritime, there's potential for maritime electrification. And that could go beyond the 140 megawatts. We need to start planning now for that and not just looking at traditional solutions, but looking at peak shifting, looking at battery storage. With the waterfront, we're doing studies for the potential for a network of microgrids for customer and grid resilience. We're looking at renewable hydrogen, green hydrogen as a potential for many of the uses for decarbonizing maritime, onshore, off-road. So there's a lot of different strategies that are emerging. And especially for those load clusters, we really need to look at all of those and test those out and see what does work, scale them up.
Clearly, I think one of the outputs, if you will, from the latest technologies and the future ones is a lot of data. How do you intend to manage that? How does that play into your future plans, that whole, tidal wave of data?
The data piece is really crucial. We've got to build up platforms now that can take in data on where is load growth coming, how is the system operating. That's a close link with grid modernization, especially for things like bidirectional power flows, like doing modeling for distributed energy resources. So we have a utility technology roadmap that lays out how we're going to approach technology investments for the utility, what our current platforms are, doing gap analysis, how does that enable grid modernization and what does it enable? So that utility technology roadmap looks out over the next 20 years and starts to lay out the investments we need to undertake on the data side with platforms that we can build to take in grid data, take in customer data, piece all of that together, help us model and do scenario planning.
How do you avoid potential reliability issues going forward
in
a grid that is changing from the old, one way to a much more two way?
I think that's where you see a new R emerging with utilities, and that's a key part of our grid modernization strategy is like keep the focus on reliability, affordability, safety. That's always been there, and that requires investments even just to maintain reliability. Because you've got the load growth coming from electrification, then we need to start investing in new ways to prepare for that, new resources on the customer side, automation, things like distribution automation, things like remote switching, basically reducing the amount of grid issues that need to be solved by rolling trucks out, because that's a lengthy process, it's an expensive process. The more we can automate there, the more we can stay on top of reliability. Resilience is a key aspect too, that's that new R, resilience. If we have electrified the ferries, we need to ensure that if there's an outage, like there's some way to keep the ferries operating, there's some way to keep the buses running. And that's a big aspect for grid modernization and what we face as utilities, because we're expanding the services we provide to cities, to our cities now. We're operating the buses, we're fuel providers for people's cars, we're operating school buses. Reliability and resilience and bringing new resources to the mix to maintain that, it's crucial because we're expanding into all of those new sectors.
At the same time that Seattle City Light is advancing its transit and fleet electrification plans, they are tackling another complex challenge, building out the charging infrastructure to serve their residential customers, most of whom live in multi-unit dwellings. Transportation Electrification Portfolio Manager Angela Song walked me through the utility's approach to serving the majority multi-unit population. Just give us an insight into your role at Seattle City Light.
I was brought on to help design, deploy, and implement all of their transportation electrification programs. There's a great team behind me, so I'm not just the only one here. But really, it's to carry out a plan that they created with the community, and it's called the Transportation Electrification Strategic Investment Plan, TSIP for short.
And talk a little bit about how, kind of from a ground up, the information from the community brought you to this place.
The creation of TSIP really started with a robust, we called it phase 1 outreach, and we went to 25 to 30 different community-based organizations, government groups, entities, unions, laborers. So we kind of did a huge, diverse outreach to folks that were interested, climate, electrification at large, to help the utility understand where the priorities of the communities were. And so during that really intensive process, that's how we developed the priorities that you see today in that strategic investment plan.
So talk a little bit about the key takeaways or learnings from those interactions.
So there was 5 priorities that we developed out of TSIP. And the first and foremost is electrification of transit. The second priority that we saw, if you're not familiar with Seattle, there's a industrial part of our city. It's called the Duwamish Valley. They're really impacted by this air pollution. And so the second priority was really to clean up the fleets in that area that are running through those neighborhoods. So we're really focusing on fleet electrification and heavy duty electrification as well, because we can get the most greenhouse gas emissions impact. The third one is definitely around education and outreach. So the communities that we're talking with actually don't really know or understand the benefits of electrification. So that's a really big hurdle to get across when you're trying to advocate for electrification. The fourth priority is around increasing access to multifamily charging and off-street parking as well. So we have a lot of properties here that actually don't have driveways, so it's hard to electrify. And then the last one is around high mileage vehicles. High mileage, meaning like for-hire drivers, so taxis,
okay.
the Ubers, Lyfts.
Let's talk about that charging piece, whether it's multifamily or single family or fleets, what have you. That, as you say, without that infrastructure, it's going to be very challenging.
We're really trying to be aggressive, obviously, with our electrification goals. We're trying to hit 50 projects in 2 years. That's the timeline. And in order to meet that goal, we really have to look at our processes internally. And so we're undertaking a lot of energy to really look at what's the customer journey, I guess, at the end of the day. We're trying to map out that process in order to give our engineers and internal staff the right resources and information to make decisions. One of the priorities that I talked about is focusing on multifamily properties and then locations without driveways. And really that's the first focus for building electrification for us because it's the toughest to electrify. These buildings were built long ago, so the panel infrastructure upgrades, everything behind it needs to be kind of looked at and upgraded. We're really looking at education as the leading piece. We have a lot of customers who have tried to electrify, but it's a long process, right? Yeah. So it's really like helping them through the process, making sure that they know what type of information is needed and when, and how we work with like the contractors and electricians that are installing the equipment.
I know that some of the public charging stations I've seen, like in a library parking lot, there might be 2 or 3. Do you have a roadmap or a strategy for saying, okay, we're going to put 4 in and then 2 years we'll evaluate? How do you strategize on those public charging stations?
Yeah. The public charging stations right now is in a pilot phase. So we're aiming to install 21 by the end of Q3 of this year. Mm-hmm. So that'll kind of be the close of that. And we're going to go into a program redesign here at the end of the year. So it might look a little bit different. But the public program has essentially been built on a lot of community outreach. Go back to that again.
Exactly. It's your core.
Yeah. And it's great because, we can always lean on the community to tell us where they want our investments. That's one thing that's really great about a municipal utility because our owners are the customers. So, getting direct feedback from them is how I'm trying to approach transportation electrification, how the utility is trying to approach it. We go to community-based organizations where they're like neighborhood meetings and just talk about what we're trying to do and have them help us identify where they think charging should go. So a lot of the times it's grocery stores, libraries, like public spaces. And so we take that feedback and kind of look at the map and just kind of reassess on where the capacity is. We want to try to find spots where people can go, enjoy a cup of coffee or do groceries or something besides sit in their car and just wait for an hour.
Have you worked with any either OEMs or dealerships?
I'm really glad you brought up the dealership. This year, we're going to be at the Seattle Auto Show and partnering with the Washington State Dealership Association. And so we're really excited about that. But I think it's just the beginning for us. This plan really was put in place about 1.5 years ago. So our focus has really been on the program side. Now we're going to start pulling into more of those partnerships and trying to accelerate the deployment of all these little smaller pilot projects so we can add to those learnings.
Okay, so a lot to be determined.
Yeah. I think we are on the cusp of a lot of growth, a lot of change, and a lot of innovation.
Given what you've been through so far in this electrification process, what would you recommend to some other utility that's just starting on their journey?
Yeah, well, I will say the community outreach is very much key to developing the strategy because of our robust efforts on the front end to really understand what community wanted to see, their priorities, their needs in transportation electrification. The strategic investment plan is a really clear pathway for me, my team, for the utility to kind of execute on these programs and know that, we're supporting the community and what they want to see. I'll also say the collaboration and partnership is key. These are large projects that take sometimes years to be installed and operational. And so partnerships are really key to all of that, making sure you have the right people at the table at the right time.
As you heard the Seattle City Light team mention, a crucial input into their future-ready grid planning is an electrification baseline assessment, which was conducted on their behalf by the Electric Power Research Institute. EPRI Senior Project Manager Jamie Dunkley shared the report's findings. Just describe for our audience just how this assessment came about and kind of your top level learnings and where you think it'll go for Seattle City Light.
Seattle City Light, as well as the city of Seattle, had a number of goals that they were trying to meet related to climate change. The most kind of stringent of them was the Green New Deal, which required 100% carbon neutral by 2030. This study took a number of different goals and laid out a few different scenarios to try to address each of them and what it would take to meet each of them. Seattle's uniquely positioned in almost all of their power is renewable. And so as they think about decarbonizing for climate change, thinking about what if we electrify all of buildings, all of transportation, what would it take? And I think we approach this from two sides. So not only thinking about what transportation would need and what buildings would need in terms of energy and power, but what is available on the grid side. So where is there available capacity to be able to fulfill the needs that we're looking towards the future for? So we did this assessment from both sides, and kind of we're trying to pull them together to see, where is there available capacity? Where might we have more demand as Seattle thinks about their strategy moving forward in the space?
So dive in a little bit on the transportation piece, that part of the grid that's really now a big focus for Seattle City Light.
In this study, we ran 3 different scenarios, and we did it on the buildings as well as the transportation side. And so within these scenarios, we're ranging from business as usual scenario to this 100% electrified. So that means all school buses, all medium and heavy duty transport, all garbage trucks, everything is electric. And while most of the energy will be attributed to light duty vehicles, a fleet will electrify in a short amount of time and they will all need power at the same spot. Seattle City Lights is already in there kind of trying to understand this better, but for each fleet, you need to have an understanding of how many miles are driven a day and how that varies, because that's probably not the same every day, what the dwell time is. And so what I mean by that is how long is the vehicle parked at the depot? And then the efficiency of the vehicle. So you can imagine, how far does 1 kilowatt hour get you? Is it 1 mile, 2 miles? When your truck is fully loaded, that's probably fewer miles that it can go. When it's really cold and you're running your heater, that's probably fewer miles. So there's variability within there. But from that, you can understand how much energy is needed per day. And based on the constraints of how far the vehicles need to go and how long they're parked, you have flexibility in when you charge. And so different fleet managers can kind of program their charging to impact the grid less.
Let's switch gears just slightly to maybe the data side of the modeling and or how data will grow in importance in terms of managing these kinds of fleets and the load.
Yeah, so this is a very active research that I'm working on now. Okay. Getting characteristic behavior is the first step with that. The second step is figuring out where this is going to happen, right? And so a data set figuring out, where are these commercial fleets going to be? And you can go about this a few different ways. Maybe it's square footage of a building. Maybe it's satellite imagery showing where the warehouses might be. And then the final one is figuring out how many. So how many cars, trucks. That one can be a little bit tricky. So there's registration data out there. So companies will obviously register their vehicles because they're paying insurance. But often they're registered at headquarters and not at all of the separate little warehouses. So it's a combination of all of those things. And we're finding it's hard because there isn't one perfect data set. So it's kind of figuring out the limitations and the advantages of each one and kind of piecing them together. And I guess kind of the final thing is local intel. I mean, Seattle City Light knows their customers better than anybody else. And so kind of being able to kind of ask them, where do you see activity? Who's planning on electrifying at some point? Do you have any behavior data on them? So we can put kind of ground truth, all of it in kind of the local logistics.
In the research you did, any sort of big challenges you see ahead that are either obvious or not so obvious that were surprises in the data or the research?
We looked at both the grid side and the needs side. What was great to see is there is a lot of available capacity on Seattle's grid. Right. So 100% electrification, they can do that. The issue with that is figuring out when and where it's available. So that's kind of the trickier part. And we produced quite a few maps where you could see where there might be areas that were a little bit more limited and then areas that might have more capacity. So I think thinking through what kind of electrification would happen in those potentially limited areas and different management strategies that could be used to make electrification still work in those spots without putting in a lot of investment into the grid would be one thing. And then I think the other one that really came to light, which I was surprised of, there are a lot of people living in multi-unit dwellings in Seattle. And at least from the transportation side of things, it's putting in chargers for all of those folks can be hard. So obviously you want to put chargers in places where they already go. It could be workplace, can be a really big component of that. Supermarkets, movie theaters when we do that again.
Yeah. Shopping malls or
shopping malls. Yeah. So
areas,
thinking about, and then of course having those fast chargers around, especially in places where there are many residents and multi-unit dwellings will be really important.
Were there particular surprises in as you modeled the loads and changes over time, especially with the target dates of 2030 and then 2042?
In this environment where there's a lot of flexibility with working, what does that mean for commutes and transportation? So does that mean we will see people just driving less? Will they change kind of their habits on how they use their vehicles? Will they need only one? So that was something that, we just had to go with what we know or what we knew. And so that'll be interesting to see, on this long time frame. If I had a crystal ball to predict that, right. I should be playing the lotto.
So, yeah, definitely. I agree.
That's a hard one.
It is a really hard one because I do think we've seen a big shift in who's going to a place to work or not, or some hybrid, and it's TBD.
And are people moving out of the city because they don't need to be here anymore? Exactly. So I think a lot of the big unknowns are kind of about this population change given the 2 years we've just had. And if that lingers for this 10 or 15 year time frame we're looking at or not, or maybe we just kind of spring back into what we're used to.
I wanted to shift gears to, again, the local community information that was part of this assessment. Can you talk a little bit about how, with Seattle's focus on disadvantaged communities, if you will, or what have you, how that played into some of the assessments?
Yeah, well, that's definitely something that's at the forefront of kind of what Seattle wants to make sure that they're addressing as they move forward. I think with the study, we planned out what was needed in terms of power and energy. I think how Seattle decides to implement that is really where that comes in, because no one wants someone telling you what technology you should adopt. So it's really about kind of understanding each individual community needs. So there's not going to be one blueprint for everyone, which I think makes it hard, right? It's a unique solution for each one. And so understanding for people in those potentially disadvantaged communities, how they commute, what do they use, what are their habits, kind of where might they dwell for a while, where kind of maybe electric charging would come into play. I think kind of prioritizing those communities first as this technology comes out will be really key.
Did you see any takeaways that perhaps other utilities that are in similar situations that you could recommend?
Getting your kind of head around what it would take is a really useful exercise, right? And so the information that we provided here is the energy and power needed if we don't add any smarts to the system. And what I mean by that is like managed charging or batteries or some kind of tool that you could use to kind of flatten the load. And so it's really almost a worst case scenario when we look at grid impacts. And so I think any utility that's trying to think about, can we do this? A similar sort of assessment where, okay, how much power is needed? How much energy is needed? What do we got? And then start pulling those two things together, and where there's maybe a disconnect, figure out strategies that would help you get there. So I think that's useful for any utility thinking about, really promoting electrification and decarbonization.
Beyond electrification, Seattle City Light is investing equally in its build-out of renewable energy solutions. Uzma Siddiqi, Senior Manager of Grid Modernization, highlighted some of her work, including how the utility is looking at renewable energy to enhance grid reliability. Uzma, tell us about your role at Seattle City Light. What's your team doing?
I am the Senior Manager for Grid Modernization and Strategic Technology at Seattle City Light. Two teams in that. One group of people is working on grid modernization, which means how are we getting our grid ready for all the parts and pieces of things that are coming at it, new electrification loads, our distributed energy resources like solar, customer batteries, how are we getting ready for that? And then the other team is really figuring out how we take those technologies and apply them at City Light. So for example, we're talking about a large battery for the ferry system to help modulate their load. So lots of interesting work going on in this team.
Excellent, thanks. Can you talk a little bit about the EPRI assessment and how you've leveraged that so far, or where you think that will take you?
I think that it's been wonderful to help establish kind of the baseline, and then helps us to look at what challenges lie ahead. It's really hard to solve a problem that you haven't defined. So what does the load look like? What does transportation electrification load look like? What does building electrification load look like? And then we can layer on solutions on top of that. And that's really how we're going to solve the challenge of this new grid.
Can you talk a little bit about how the ferry system and charging electric ferry boats is going to look on your grid?
For the last year or two, we've really established a partnership with Washington State Ferries. They see electrification as part of their solution to decarbonize their diesel fuel use. One of the things is it's a large load. So our grid wasn't designed for that large load. We can make some changes, and we are, but we'd like to figure out, are there different approaches to take? Do we always just do the thing that we've been doing for the last 5, 10, 20 years? One of the neat ideas here is to actually put a battery, a large battery, that will help charge 2 boats. So about 8 times during the day, 2 boats come onto the system. And we'll be able to charge the single boat using the grid as it stands, and we'll be able to charge 2 boats because we add the grid as we stand plus the battery. And so that's a great way of using the system that we have as efficiently as we can.
In terms of energy mix, are you exploring hydrogen?
Absolutely. I think that we are looking at lots of different technologies. Hydrogen has some great features. One of the advantages that we have is that because our fuel mix is so green, we're able to take that green electricity and generate hydrogen. Hydrogen can be stored and used for other uses, such as ships or trucks or forklifts. I mean, just so many different kind of end users. And then the other thing that you can do with hydrogen is to use a fuel cell and make electricity again. So it becomes an energy storage system also. Seattle City Light is looking at everything.
Makes sense. You mentioned energy storage, and in this case, batteries. Can you talk a little bit about your strategy now, or how you see it playing out behind the meter or in front of the meter in the grid, and kind of where that is now and where you think it's going to go?
Yeah, so we are actually developing a DER strategy. We are stepping back. We've been doing this ad hoc, and we've gotten to a certain point, and we've said, okay, now we need to step back and make sure that we're looking at this really programmatically instead of individually. Batteries are fabulous for resiliency. We have a microgrid that we installed at the Miller Community Center, paid for with a Washington Clean Energy Fund grant, in part. And I'm super excited about that because it provides resiliency to a community center, which means that we're providing for the whole, right? Anyone who needs it can come to that space. So that's one use of a battery. You can have a battery for your own home's resiliency. Other places in the US, they're using it for things that are more big grid related, more of the transmission grid. And the Pacific Northwest is not part of an organized market, but we might be heading in that direction. So some of those use cases could be monetized. And we'll see what happens.
In terms of where your grid modernization process is, are there takeaways for other utilities that you might say, hey, here's what I would do or I wouldn't do, or kind of some high-level feedback to your colleagues around the country?
So one thing that we did was that we, as a team, did a grid modernization plan. We used the EPRI framework and talked to our colleagues within City Light and asked for, what should we be doing? Where do you see the challenges of the grid? Got some great feedback, developed a document, have been budgeting, resourcing it. We also went back to EPRI and asked them to look at our grid mod plan and say, okay, we've looked at it with our City Light focus. Now take a look at it from a more industry-wide focus. And it's actually been really gratifying to see how much of what we internally had decided they have endorsed.
One of the things I was intrigued about, like the grid modernization, is this idea of a flexible grid. Can you talk a little bit about that? How that will play out, or kind of your vision, or where that might be in, let's say, 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so let's talk about the old grid.
Right.
So let's start there. So what happens is there's generation and load. And the electrical grid requires balance, instantaneous balance. And where we used to be was that our load could do whatever it wanted, flip the switch, turns on, the generator balances. Well, now we have this new type of generation that isn't controllable. It comes on when the sun shines and the wind blows. And so we've got 100% of our generation is no longer within our control. So when that happens, something has to happen on the other side also. So that's where this whole idea of flexible load comes in. It's really important to try to figure out how we can adapt. I see managed charging of electric vehicles. Perhaps, doing staged 15 minutes, having 4 groups, 15 minutes at a time. I see demand response. I see customers being told information such that they can adapt their behavior, and they will do it either for a financial benefit or because it makes them feel good. So we're going to figure this out. But we definitely need to have flexible load in order to really make the system work as it's evolving.
Right, and as you integrate those moving parts that in real time.
That's right.
I don't envy you. You have a pretty big mandate. Can you talk about maybe the top 1, 2, or 3 things that is really a challenge?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge for me is the paradigm shift that utilities are on. I've looked at the loads for Seattle City Light starting in like the 40s, and we were on this trajectory where we just kept going up. Year over year, it was up. And then we hit the 70s and 80s, and it kind of caps off. And
a little bit of a bend in the curve.
A little bit of bend, and really a flattening, and even a little bit of a reduction. And now with all this electrification, we see that changing and going back up. Well, Basically, what that means is this entire group of people who's been working at an electric utility is really used to a certain paradigm. And now we're changing the paradigm. So there's a huge change management component. It's people, right? We all are trying to figure out how the new world looks while we look backwards and it's not applicable. Right. So that I see as the kind of the biggest challenge is just the paradigm change that we're happening. And folks who look back and say, well, that's not how it was 5 years ago. It's like, you're right.
You're right.
But that's not how it's going to be in 5 years either.
I think Emeka got it right. What Seattle City Light is doing with electrification and renewable energy does represent some of the industry's boldest thinking. It was great to spend time with the Seattle City Light team and learn about their future endeavors. I hope you enjoyed it too. I'm Neil Strother. See you next time.